I meet so many people on cruises who tell me they do not gamble. However, whilst they might not gamble in the casino, they gamble with the most important thing of all on the cruise, the cabin. I'm going to tell you why I think most people get cabins wrong and what savvy cruisers do that I think you should really consider doing too. Welcome aboard, I'm Gary Bembridge, and here's my tips on finding the perfect cabin and why I think most advice that people give you is wrong. One of the things that I always avoid, and I recommend that you avoid, is looking at booking a guaranteed fare. So guaranteed fare is basically where you book a particular level inside, an ocean view, a balcony, a suite, and you don't get to choose the cabin. The cruise line will choose you a cabin. In reality, it'll choose you from the worst cabins that are left over in that grade, because people who have booked where they can choose their own cabin will have gone in and swept up the best cabins, the ones perhaps with the best location, the biggest balcony, the nicest bathroom facilities or whatever. So you're basically left with the dregs. So guaranteed fares is very much like gambling. You imagine you go to a slot machine, you put your money in, which is going to be the same probably as the people who've chosen the cabin themselves. You hit the button and occasionally you'll hit the jackpot, but like 99% of the times you're not, and you're going to get the dud cabin. It's really important to understand that the cruise line allocates the leftover cabins. So I know so many people that go with guaranteed fares and have ended up with really, really terrible cabins. So I always go in with fares where I choose my own cabin. Now, it doesn't always cost more, it might be a small amount. So I booked a celebrity cruise recently on an America cruise, and to choose my own cabin actually costs exactly the same as a guaranteed fare. So why wouldn't you do it? Even if there's a small premium, really think about the advantage of choosing the best, not being allocated the dregs. Location, location, location is really important when thinking about a cabin. So a couple of things to consider. In the front of the ship and at the rear of the ship is where you're going to have the most movement, because the ship will basically pivot like that. So the middle of the ship is really going to be the most stable. So particularly if you're going somewhere that's likely to have rough seas, which of course you can never predict. Another reason for avoiding cabins in the front of the ship, as well as from a movement, is if you're on a cruise which has tender ports, so the ship isn't actually docked like this one is here, is the anchor. So you might find very early in the morning the anchor is dropped, waking you up. So I've been on cruises before when I hadn't followed the device. I was in cabins towards the front there, and every morning, crack of dawn, we were woken up by the noise of the anchor. So it's another reason for avoiding cabins towards the front of the ship. There is one other consideration if you do go for cabins at the back of the ship. So many people like these aft cabins because you get views leaving ports. However, you can often get a lot of vibration from the engines, and so that's something to bear in mind, is you may have much more vibration than you do in other parts of the ship. Being in the middle of the ship is always the best, and it has a huge difference in the amount of movement. So I've been on cruises where I've been midship. Friends of mine have had cabins at the front, and it has been incredible, the difference in the amount of movement. So that's the first thing to consider. The second thing though is you also want to be in the middle of the decks. Why? For example, if you've got a 14-deck ship, you want to be kind of halfway between. So the reason is along one level here, you normally have like the promenade deck. So you'll have a lot of the restaurants, the shops, the casino, that kind of stuff. And then further up at the top, you'll have the leader deck with the pools and so on. So actually by being in the middle of those decks, or whatever halfway through, is you've got the least amount to go down to those activities and the least amount to go up. But also being in the middle is, you'll find, generally speaking, that ships will tend to have, like in the front of the ship, they'll have things like the theatres, for example, and you'll often find they'll have like the restaurants at the rear of the ship, because that's often where the kitchens are. So again, by being in the middle, you're again equidistant from everything. So that's another tip that I have. So you want to be in the middle of the ship, but also in the middle of the ship, literally. And another really critical tip, and one that I absolutely swear by, is you want to be surrounded on all sides by cabins. So cabins above you, below you, either side of you, because that's going to buffer you, hopefully, from kind of noisy venues. What you want to try and do is make sure that you have cabins opposite you. So take a look on the deck plan, because you can often find you might have a laundry room, which have lots of people coming and going. You might have a crew door where they keep coming and going. So for example, I've had that before, where all hours of the day and night, you've got crew clanging and banging, coming in and out. So you really make sure that you look on the deck plan and you've got cabins opposite you. Now bear in mind though, you also need to look for noisy venues. So let's talk about some of the things you should look on the deck plan and some of the venues that you should actually try and avoid. One venue you want to miss is this one here, which during the day is nice and calm and quiet, but at night it actually becomes the nightclub. So you can have booming sounds So for example, here on the ship I'm on at the moment, it starts at 10:30 at night and goes until late. So make sure you're avoiding anything that's a nightclub or a live music venue. That base really does travel. You also want to avoid the pool deck. So you don't want a cabin underneath the pool deck, because in the morning you'll often find they're scraping all the chairs around, setting up. Also during the day, people will be scraping the lounges and the chairs, moving them around. Also in the evenings you might find there's pool deck parties. You might have the bass booming underneath. I had that once when I made that mistake with late night parties. Another area to look out for is if you have a running or walking track like this one here and there's cabins underneath. I discovered the hard way that having a cabin underneath, you could often be woken up early in the morning with the thud, thud, thud of people kind of running and walking, which can be really, really disruptive, particularly because even though they often ask people to only start running after 8 o'clock in the morning, you'll find people pay no attention to that. The theatre is another venue that you want to make sure you avoid having a cabin above, below, or even near the entrance or exit to it, because there'll be rehearsals during the day, often. Like for example here, there's a show at 8 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, and so it can be really kind of noisy and boomy. One of the places that you do want to try and avoid is being underneath the gym, for two reasons. One of which is you'll often find people slamming down weights. Like my workout today, people were doing that, they were kind of dropping weights. But also I made the mistake once of being above the studio where they're the classes, and early in the morning into the evening there'd often be booming bass from the classes. This is also another venue that you want to make sure you avoid when booking a cabin, certainly opposite, which is the laundrette. The laundrettes can get really busy. They can be quite noisy, not just from the machines, but also people could gather here, they're talking. So also try to avoid having cabins either side if you've got an inside cabin, because the machines can sometimes make a lot of noise, and they will often be going from early in the morning till late at night. Live music venues are also one to avoid. So for example, there's a band that plays in this live venue here, so they will play often late night sets. There'll be rehearsals during the day, so you do want to kind of avoid any live music venues, particularly if they've got whole big bands, because that is going to, again, booming music, lots of bass, so another one to avoid. Depending on the layout of the ship, it's also sometimes a good idea to avoid the lift areas, because if you've got cabins that are right next to the lift, you often have the dinging of the lifts, people getting off, standing here, chatting, and so on, and it can be rather disruptive as well. So try and avoid the lifts. When choosing your cabin, another critical thing to look for on the deck plan is interconnecting cabins. So for example, this cabin here has an interconnecting door to the next room. Now this is actually where it's located. It's not too bad because it's a little bit out of the way, but do look for interconnecting doors, because you will find that you may end up with someone who watches television loudly, argues a lot, talks loudly on the phone, parties, whatever. Strongly recommend you do that, unless of course you're traveling with somebody. Also, it's really important to approach the whole concept of upgrades with a lot of caution. People get very excited when they hear about upgrades. There's a couple of things that you should strongly consider. First of all, when you book, you actually have to opt out of auto upgrade. So auto upgrade is when the cruise line can just decide to move you into a bigger cabin. So for example, like I booked a balcony cabin and they could perhaps move me up into a big suite like this. However, I recommend opting out, particularly if you've chosen your cabin, because again, if you get upgraded, you normally have no ability to go back to the cabin you chose. So if you get given a cabin that's not ideal, then you have no recourse. So for example, I often get messages from people that got moved to a supposedly better cabin, but suddenly found themselves at the front of the ship and they're very prone to seasickness, and they were doing somewhere transatlantic, which was very rough, and they had a miserable time, but they couldn't go back. The second thing that cruise lines do these days is they'll start sending you emails in the run up to the cruise, offering you the chance to bid for an upgrade. A couple of watch outs. First of all, make sure that if you are considering to move and to a better cabin through bidding, is check what it would actually cost you anyway to move. So you can choose your own cabin. I have met many people, for example, on a recent Celebrity Edge trip, people had bid to move to one of their lofts, and they realized once they'd bid and had been accepted and charged that they could have done it for much less by just going to their travel agent and doing it anyway. Second thing to remember is, again, the minute it gets accepted is you're moved and you have no recourse, and you're charged straight away. Thirdly, if you are traveling solo, the price that you're bidding is per person, so it's going to be double that. So even if you're solo and you bid, remember you're paying double that price. So be extremely cautious. Moving to a better cabin may not be a better cabin. Again, you're moving to a better grade in the cruise line's perspective. It may not be for you. A lot of people ask me whether they should get a cabin on the port or the starboard side. For those who don't know, if you're facing the forwards, so you've got the bridge at the front, on the left hand side is the port side, easy to remember because it's got 4 letters left, 4 letters port. The right hand side is the starboard side. Now it really doesn't matter, because if you are sailing at night or a sea day, like today's a sea day, as you can see there's no land, there's no scenery at all, so it doesn't really matter which side you are. There are very few times when it does make sense to be port or starboard. So for example, if you're sailing into New York, being on the left hand side, the port side, may be a good idea because you're going to sail past the Statue of Liberty. And if you're sailing out, you might want on the starboard side because the Statue of Liberty on your right hand side. However, in most cases, on those sort of scenic things, you're going to want to be out on deck anyway. So if you're going to scenic sailing like, say, Glacier Bay in Alaska, the captain will move the ship around so both sides of the ship get the views. But you should again be outside getting the views, like on the deck like I am now, to get the best views. So it's much more important to focus on where your cabin is within the ship, rather than worrying too much about port and starboard. The ship can dock on either side. So we were in Lanzarote yesterday, for example, and the ship was docked on the starboard side. So don't think port means you're going to be on the port side at all. Really don't get hung up about it. Focus on where your cabin is much more important. Another thing to think about when choosing your cabin is what happens if you get isolated in your cabin. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but you could perhaps get norovirus, which certainly in the season can often have many outbreaks on ships, as it does on land. Or even if you perhaps get COVID, for example, you could be then required to isolate in your cabin. I discovered this the hard way. Many years ago when I started my cruising career, I'd booked an ocean view cabin. Unfortunately, I hadn't followed all these tips that I've learned. So actually the walking and running track was above me. I actually got norovirus and I was made to stay in my cabin for a couple of days. It was very small. It was very cramped. I didn't have any outside space I could go to because I had no balcony, and I had the people thumping above me. And so these days now would always prefer to choose a balcony cabin, partly because I like a balcony cabin, but also with the small chance that I ever get isolated. I know it's a small chance, but something to bear in mind, could be a factor when choosing a cabin if you do have to spend a lot of time there. One really important tip is if you need an accessible cabin, you've got a wheelchair or accessibility needs, to get those cabins, you need to book way in advance. You need to be planning way in advance of anybody else, because those cabins, there's not many of them on a ship, and they're always in very high demand. So make sure that you plan way in advance to get those cabins. Why don't you join me over in this video where I'll talk about 5 things that smart cruisers all do, and one they all argue about. See you over there.